The sound of Garrick Ashford's boots echoed down the empty street of Eldridge Falls, a town that once felt like a peaceful escape from the chaos of the world. But today, the town felt wrong, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air was thick with unease, as if the very ground beneath him was hiding something. The sky above was clouded with an unnatural gray, casting an eerie pallor over the rows of old, creaky houses. As Garrick walked through the quiet streets, he noticed people standing in doorways, their eyes darting around, whispering in hushed voices. There was a nervousness in the air, a tension that clung to the buildings and the people who lived in them. It was as though the town had become a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that it was just his imagination. But the longer he stayed in Eldridge Falls, the more he felt like an outsider. The friendly smiles that greeted him when he first arrived seemed forced, like they were hiding something dark. He had come here to start fresh, to escape the chaos of the city, but now he wasn't so sure. The town's peaceful exterior had cracked, and something sinister was waiting just beneath the surface. Garrick had barely made it halfway down Main Street when the emergency broadcast system blared to life, cutting through the silence with a jarring screech. The voice that came over the speakers was cold, distant, and urgent. Emergency alert. Mysterious creatures spotted in the vicinity. Remain indoors and stay alert. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, each syllable sinking into the pit of his stomach. There was no explanation, no further details, just that one chilling message. His heart raced as the sound of the broadcast echoed in his ears. Around him, the people of Eldridge Falls reacted in different ways. Some rushed inside, slamming doors behind them, while others froze in place, their faces pale with fear. Garrick turned to look at a woman standing nearby, her hand trembling as she clutched the edge of a building. Her wide eyes locked onto his, and she took a step toward him, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know, do you?" she said, her words shaky. They're not from this world." She didn't elaborate further, only shook her head, her eyes filled with terror. Before Garrick could ask her anything else, she turned and hurried into the safety of her home, leaving him standing there, confused and more frightened than before. His mind raced. What was going on? Creatures? Not from this world? He had to know more. The warning was enough to send most people running for cover, but Garrick's curiosity got the better of him. He wasn't about to let something like this go unexplored. His instincts told him that the answers were out there, somewhere in the town, or maybe even in the factory where he worked. The factory had always been a place of mystery, its towering walls and hidden corners giving off an unsettling vibe. But today, it felt different. It felt like the heart of whatever was happening in Eldridge Falls. As he made his way toward the factory, Garrick overheard a conversation between three workers standing outside. Brennan Crow, Dorian Blackwell, and Thaddeus Fenn were talking in low, hurried voices, glancing nervously over their shoulders as if they feared being overheard. "I heard strange noises in the woods last night," Brennan said, his voice shaking. "Like something big moving through the trees. I don't know what it was, but it didn't sound right." Dorian nodded, his eyes wide. "I saw something too, something tall, dark. I don't know. It didn't look like any animal I've ever seen." Thaddeus let out a nervous laugh, but it was hollow. "You're all just spooked. The alert's probably just a false alarm. Nothing to worry about." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted toward the woods, his hand twitching at his side. Garrick could see the fear in their faces, the way their hands trembled, even if they tried to hide it. Something was out there, something that had them all on edge. Garrick quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. The factory was just ahead, but as he neared the gates, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the distance. But as he focused, he saw it clearly. A figure standing motionless in the trees at the edge of the woods. It was tall, too tall for a person, and it seemed to be watching him. Its features were obscured by the darkness, but Garrick could feel its eyes on him, cold and unblinking. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran through his body. He tried to look away, but the figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for him to approach. His legs felt like lead as he walked closer to the factory, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He had to get inside. He had to get away from whatever that thing was. Just as he reached the factory door, the lights above flickered. Garrick froze. The sudden darkness felt suffocating, like the very air had thickened around him. The hairs on his arms prickled as he listened, straining to hear any sound. And then, from the woods, came a low, guttural growl, something that sent a wave of pure terror through his body. It wasn't like anything he had ever heard before. It was deep, like the growl of some enormous beast, but it was mixed with something else, something almost human. Garrick's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the window. He couldn't help himself. He had to look. His eyes scanned the darkness outside, and then, in the far corner of the yard, he saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the night, staring back at him. The creatures were out there, watching him, waiting. His heart pounded in his chest, and he stumbled backward, his mind racing with a million thoughts. What were they? Why were they watching him? What did they want? Before he could gather his thoughts, a cold wind blew through the factory, and the lights flickered again, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. He looked back toward the door, but the figure he had seen earlier was gone. It was as if it had melted into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. But the feeling of being watched remained. The growl from the woods echoed again, closer this time, and Garrick knew with a sickening certainty that whatever was out there wasn't going to stop until it found him. As the door slammed shut behind him, locking him inside, Garrick's mind raced. The creatures were real. The silent one was real, and whatever had brought them to Eldridge Falls was just beginning. Garrick stepped into the factory, the heavy door creaking as it closed behind him. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, with the smell of oil and metal. The factory, usually a place of constant noise and activity, felt unnervingly quiet today. The hum of machines was barely audible, and the usual buzz of workers was replaced with an eerie silence. The walls, once bright with the glow of fluorescent lights, now seemed dim and oppressive. Every step Garrick took echoed through the cavernous space, amplifying the sense of isolation. He glanced around, trying to shake off the growing feeling that something was off. The warden, the factory overseer, was standing near the control panel, his back to Garrick. He seemed distant, his posture stiff, as though he were lost in thought. When Garrick approached, the warden turned slowly, his eyes briefly meeting Garrick's before quickly looking away. "Get to work," he said, his voice cold and sharp, but there was an edge to it, something that didn't sit right with Garrick. The warden's usual stern demeanor had always been unsettling, but today, it felt different. There was a tension in his voice, a hint of fear, as though he was trying to hide something. It was clear that the warden wasn't himself. Garrick nodded and made his way to his station, but as he passed the other workers, he noticed that they, too, were acting strangely. Brennan Crow, Dorian Blackwell, and Thaddeus Fenn were all going about their tasks, but their movements were stiff, their eyes constantly flicking toward the windows. It was as if they were expecting something, waiting for something to happen. Every now and then, one of them would pause, glance nervously toward the door, and then quickly return to their work. Garrick couldn't shake the feeling that they were all hiding something, but no one was talking. The silence in the factory was deafening, broken only by the occasional clank of machinery. As Garrick tried to focus on his own work, he couldn't help but notice the strange happenings around him. Machines, which had always run smoothly, suddenly malfunctioned, gears jammed, belts snapped, and lights flickered on and off. It was as though the factory itself was fighting against them, as if something was trying to stop the work. The doors creaked open and shut on their own, as if moved by an unseen hand. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the corners of the room, flickering in and out of existence. Every time Garrick looked away, the shadows seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. The workers tried to act normal, but their unease was impossible to ignore. Their eyes were wide, their movements jerky, as though they were afraid of something just beyond their sight. Garrick caught sight of Seraphine Vale, the receptionist. Standing by the front desk, her face pale, she was staring blankly at the wall, her hands trembling slightly. When Garrick approached her, she snapped out of her trance, her eyes locking onto his with a look of sheer terror. "Garrick," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This place, it's cursed." Garrick frowned, confused. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low. Seraphine hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, as though she was afraid someone might be listening. "I can't say more," she whispered, "but this factory, it was built on land that was never meant to be disturbed. Dark forces are bound here, and they're waking up." She paused, swallowing hard. "You need to be careful. The creatures are coming. They'll be here soon." Before Garrick could ask anything else, Seraphine turned and hurried away, disappearing into the back of the factory. Her words hung in the air like a warning, but Garrick couldn't make sense of them. Creatures? Dark forces? What was she talking about? He had heard rumors about the factory's strange history, but he had never taken them seriously. Now, with the factory's eerie atmosphere and Seraphine's cryptic warning, he wasn't so sure. The warden appeared again, his face grim as he pulled Garrick aside. "Listen to me," he said in a low voice, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "This factory, it was built on sacred land, a place where dark forces were sealed away long ago. The workers here, they've been dealing with this for years. The curse, it's real. But I can't explain it all to you now. Just focus on your work and don't ask questions. Do your job and stay out of trouble." Garrick stared at him, his mind racing. A curse? Dark forces? What was happening in this town? The warden's warning only made him more determined to find out the truth. But before he could respond, the warden turned and walked away, leaving Garrick standing there, more confused than ever. As the hours passed, the factory seemed to grow even more oppressive. The shadows grew longer, and the air felt heavier. The workers' unease was palpable, and Garrick could sense that something terrible was about to happen. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being watched. As night fell, the factory grew even quieter. The workers began to leave, their faces drawn and pale. Garrick, however, was one of the last to leave. He had stayed late to finish up some work, but now, as he stood by the factory door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for him. The air outside was cold, and the wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the wind that sent a shiver down his spine. It was the low growl that echoed through the woods. Garrick froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was deep, like the growl of some enormous beast, but there was something unnatural about it. Something wrong. He stepped forward, trying to peer into the darkness, but all he could see were the trees swaying in the wind. And then he saw them. Eyes. Hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the night, staring back at him from the shadows. The creatures were out there, watching him. Garrick's breath caught in his throat as the eyes seemed to move, circling him like prey. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, and his legs trembled. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. He took a step back, his heart racing, but the eyes didn't move. They just stared at him, unblinking, unfeeling. The air grew colder, and Garrick could feel the weight of the creature's gaze pressing down on him. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. He felt like he was being hunted, like he was the prey in some twisted game. Just as he turned to run back inside, the growl grew louder, closer, and the eyes followed him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he felt the presence of something behind him. But before he could take another step, the factory door slammed open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the Silent One. His face was unreadable, his eyes cold and empty. The creature in the woods vanished instantly, as though it had never been there at all. But the terror lingered, gnawing at Garrick's insides. He had no idea who or what the Silent One was, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening in Eldridge Falls, it was far worse than he could have ever imagined. The next night, the weight of the warning gnawed at Garrick. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was out there, hidden in the woods, waiting for him to find it. Despite the terror that had gripped him since his first encounter with the creatures, he couldn't stay away. He had to know what they were, what they wanted, and why they were so connected to Eldridge Falls. With only a flashlight in hand, he stepped into the dense forest, the trees towering above him like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and every rustle in the underbrush made his heart race. The deeper he ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in around him. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the woods. There was no wind, no animals, nothing but the sound of his own footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. He shivered, his breath coming in short, anxious bursts. The flashlight flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. He paused, checking the light, but it was working fine. It was the woods that were wrong. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and every step he took felt like it was pulling him deeper into something dark and ancient. After what felt like hours, Garrick stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight bathed the area in a pale, ghostly glow, and that's when he saw them. The creatures. At first, they were just shadows, moving in the periphery of his vision. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw them clearly. They were tall, their bodies long and unnaturally thin, their limbs stretching far beyond what was humanly possible. Their skin was a dark, ashen gray, and their eyes, those glowing eyes, burned with an unnatural light, like two lanterns in the darkness. They moved with an eerie grace, as if they were floating rather than walking. Their limbs twisted and contorted in ways that made Garrick's stomach turn, but it was their eyes that held him captive. They glowed with an intensity that made him feel like they were seeing straight through him, peeling away the layers of his mind. The creatures didn't make a sound, but their presence was deafening, like the silence before a storm. Garrick stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The terror was overwhelming, but there was something else, something deeper, that unsettled him. One of the creatures, the tallest of them all, turned its head slowly, its glowing eyes locking onto Garrick's. His heart skipped a beat. The connection was instant, and it felt as though the creature was looking right into his soul. The air around him seemed to freeze, and he felt a cold, gnawing fear crawl up his spine. The creature didn't move, but it didn't need to. Garrick's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. It was as if he knew this creature, had known it for a long time. The recognition was sickening. He didn't know how or why, but he was certain that this creature knew him too. It wasn't just some random monster from the woods. It was tied to him, to his past, to something he couldn't remember but desperately needed to understand. As the creature's gaze held him captive, Garrick felt a sudden, horrifying realization settle in his gut. He had been here before, not in this exact place, but in a way that he couldn't explain. He had seen these creatures, or something like them, in his dreams. He had heard their growls in the dead of night, felt their eyes on him even when he was wide awake. They were connected to him, somehow. His bloodline, his ancestors. The curse. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth was too much to bear. These creatures weren't just random beasts of the woods. They were part of his past, and now they were part of his future. The creatures began to move toward him, their glowing eyes never leaving his face. Garrick's legs trembled, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, as though the creature's gaze had paralyzed him. He could feel their presence growing stronger, could hear the soft rustle of their limbs as they glided through the underbrush. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was nowhere to run. They were everywhere, closing in from all sides. His breath came in ragged gasps, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Then, just as one of the creatures reached out a long, bony hand toward him, Garrick heard a voice. It wasn't a sound that came from the creatures, but from deep within his own mind. It was a whisper, cold and insistent. "You are one of us now." The words echoed in his head and Garrick's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. The creatures, they knew him. They had always known him. He was part of their world now, tied to them in a way he couldn't understand. The curse was real, and it had claimed him as its own. Fear surged through him, and with a sudden burst of adrenaline, Garrick turned and fled. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, and he ran blindly through the woods, his heart pounding in his chest. The growls of the creatures echoed behind him, growing louder with every step. He could hear their footsteps, their limbs scraping against the ground, but he didn't dare look back. The fear was too overwhelming. They were right behind him, their eyes burning into his back. He pushed himself harder, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the trees. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around him. He could feel the creatures gaining on him, their growls growing louder, more insistent. His legs burned, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't let them catch him. But just as he thought he was going to collapse from exhaustion, he heard something else, a voice. A familiar voice, cutting through the darkness. Garrick. It was the warden's voice. Garrick's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wondered if he was imagining it. But the voice was real. It was there, calling his name. And then through the trees he saw a figure, the silent one, standing in the clearing, his face unreadable as always. The creatures stopped, their glowing eyes fixed on the silent one, and for a moment, everything was still. The air was thick with tension, and Garrick could feel the terror in his bones. The creatures didn't move, but they didn't leave either. They just stood there, watching, waiting. And Garrick, his heart still racing, knew that whatever was happening in these woods, whatever was tied to his bloodline, was far from over. The creatures were only the beginning. Garrick couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just out of reach, lingering like a shadow in the corners of his mind. The creatures, the curse, the silent one, everything seemed connected, and yet nothing made sense. His heart raced as he marched toward the factory, his footsteps heavy on the cracked pavement. The town was eerily quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an oppressive silence. He knew he had to confront the warden, to demand answers, no matter the cost. The warden was waiting for him in the factory, standing by the old wooden door that led to the back offices. His face was unreadable, his eyes dark with the weight of something Garrick couldn't quite place. When Garrick entered, the warden didn't speak at first. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the warden spoke, his voice low and strained. "You want answers, don't you?" Garrick nodded, his fists clenched at his sides. "What's going on here? Why are the creatures after me? What does it all mean?" The warden took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of years was finally catching up to him. "The factory was built on land that was once sacred," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Centuries ago, this land was protected by ancient forces, forces that were bound to the creatures you've seen. They were meant to guard the land, to keep it safe, but greed changed everything." Garrick's mind raced. "Greed? What do you mean?" "The land was rich with resources," the warden continued, his eyes darkening. "Your ancestors, the Ashfords, came here seeking to exploit it. They didn't care about the land's history, its protection. They wanted the power it offered, and in their greed, they awakened the curse. The creatures were unleashed, bound to the land, bound to the Ashford bloodline. And now, it's your turn." Garrick's stomach dropped. "My bloodline?" He could barely get the words out. "What are you saying?" "The curse passed down through the generations," the warden said, his voice trembling. "And now it's come to you. The Silent One has been watching you for a reason. You're the last of your line, and the creatures, they know you. They're connected to you." Garrick's mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. But there was more. There had to be more. Just then, the door to the office creaked open, and a woman stepped inside. She was older than Garrick, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through him. She introduced herself as Isolde Gray, a local historian who had spent years studying the curse. Isolde didn't waste any time. "The Ashfords betrayed the land's protectors," she explained, her voice steady but laced with sorrow. "They didn't just exploit the resources, they broke the pact that had kept the creatures bound. And in doing so, they awakened something ancient and deadly. The creatures are not just monsters, they are guardians, protectors of the land. And now, the curse is yours to bear." Garrick's head was spinning. "What do you mean it's mine to bear? What does that even mean?" Isolde's eyes softened, but the sorrow in them was unmistakable. "The curse is a blood curse, passed down through your family. Your ancestors brought this upon themselves, and now it's your turn to face the consequences." Garrick's heart raced, his breath coming in short gasps. "What do I have to do to stop it? How can I end this?" The warden's face hardened. "There's only one way to break the curse," he said, his voice cold. "You must sacrifice someone with the same bloodline as the original curse-bearer, and that someone is you." Garrick's blood ran cold. "What? No, I can't." "You have to," the warden interrupted. "It's the only way to stop the creatures, to stop the curse. Your blood is the key. Without it, the curse will never end. The creatures will never stop hunting. Garrick felt the ground shift beneath him, his mind reeling. He was the one who had to die. His own blood, the same blood that had cursed his family for generations, was the only thing that could end it. The weight of that realization crushed him. He had come to Eldritch Falls seeking answers, but he had never imagined this. He was the key to ending the curse. But at what cost? Suddenly, a growl echoed from outside the factory, low and guttural. Garrick's heart skipped a beat. The creatures were near. He could feel their presence like a dark cloud hanging over the town. The growls grew louder, and Garrick could hear the sound of something scratching at the factory doors. The creatures were closing in, and there was no time left. Garrick turned to the warden. What do I do? How do I stop them? The warden's face was grim. You can't stop them, not now. The curse has already claimed you. The only thing left is to sacrifice yourself to end the bloodline's hold on the land. But just as the words left his mouth, the door to the factory burst open, and Garrick saw them. The creatures. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, and their growls filled the air, sending a wave of terror crashing over him. The Silent One stood at the front, his face expressionless as always, but his eyes were full of something else. Something that felt like fate. Garrick's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what he had to do, but he didn't want to. The creatures were here. They had come for him. The curse was closing in, and there was no escape. The warden's voice was barely audible over the growls of the creatures. It's too late. The town is doomed. Garrick took one last look at the factory, at the people he had come to know, and then he turned and ran. The creatures were behind him, their eyes glowing in the dark, their growls echoing in his ears. He could hear the Silent One's footsteps, steady and unhurried, as if he knew the inevitable. The curse had claimed him, and there was no way out. Garrick's heart pounded in his chest as he stood face to face with the Silent One. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes casting an eerie light across the factory's dimly lit interior. The warden and Isolde stood behind him, their faces grim, as if they had already accepted what was about to happen. But Garrick couldn't accept it. Not yet. Not without understanding what had brought him to this moment. The Silent One's presence was overwhelming, like a shadow that consumed everything around him. His face remained unreadable, as always, but there was something in his eyes now. Something that spoke of centuries of pain, of regret, and of a truth that Garrick wasn't ready to hear. The creatures stopped moving, as if waiting for something. Garrick's breath came in short gasps, his mind racing. You know why they're here, the Silent One said, his voice low and cold. You know what you must do. Garrick's hands shook as he tried to steady himself. What do you mean? What is this curse? Why me? The Silent One took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Garrick's. The creatures you've seen are not mindless beasts. They are the spirits of those who were sacrificed in the past, bound to this land by the curse your ancestors created. They are trapped here, just as you are now, and they will never leave. Garrick felt a chill run down his spine. Spirits? You mean they were once people? The Silent One nodded. Yes, they were the first to fall victim to the curse, and they will continue to hunt to take new lives until the bloodline that created them is extinguished. Your bloodline. Garrick's knees felt weak, but he refused to fall. He couldn't, not now. So what do I have to do? How do I end this? Isolde stepped forward, her voice trembling. There's only one way to break the curse, Garrick. You must sacrifice yourself. Your life is the price to pay for the sins of your ancestors. The creatures will stop hunting, and the curse will end. The words hit Garrick like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled. I have to die? The warden nodded grimly. There is no other way. You are the last of your bloodline. If you die, the curse dies with you. Garrick's mind spun. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't die. He had so much left to live for. But as he looked around at the faces of the people he had come to know, the warden, Isolde, even Seraphine, the weight of the curse pressed down on him. The creatures were out there, waiting, their growls growing louder. They were getting closer. But then the Silent One spoke again, his voice colder than ever. There is one more thing you must understand, Garrick. The curse cannot be broken by your sacrifice alone. Garrick's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? What else is there? The Silent One's eyes glinted in the darkness. It requires the death of someone close to you, someone you love. Garrick's blood ran cold. No, I won't do that. I can't. You must. The Silent One interrupted, his voice firm. The curse is not so simple. It is not just about your life. It is about the lives of those who are connected to you. The creatures are tied to your bloodline, and they will never stop until the bloodline is completely severed. Garrick's mind was reeling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had to choose between his own life and the life of someone he loved. But who? Who would he sacrifice? His heart ached as he thought of Seraphine, of Brennan, of Dorian, of Thaddeus, all the people he had come to care for. He couldn't choose. He wouldn't. The growls of the creatures grew louder, more frantic. Garrick could hear their claws scraping against the factory walls, their eyes glowing brighter in the dark. He could feel the terror closing in, suffocating him. The Silent One stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Garrick's. "You must make a choice, Garrick," the Silent One said, his voice like ice. "You can save yourself, but it will cost someone else. If you do not make the sacrifice, the creatures will claim everyone. They will never stop." Garrick's chest tightened as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He had never felt more alone, more helpless. The creatures were closing in. There was no time left. He had to act. Just as he was about to make his decision, the Silent One's voice echoed in his mind, sending a chill through his very soul. "But know this, Garrick, the curse cannot be broken. Not by your death, not by anyone's death. The creatures are eternal. They are bound to this land, and they will always claim new victims. The sacrifice is futile." Garrick froze. His breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? You said—" "I lied," the Silent One interrupted. "There is no end to the curse. There is no breaking it. The creatures will always return. They are bound to this land, and as long as the land exists, they will hunt. The only thing that changes is the face of the victim. Your bloodline will never be free." Garrick's world shattered. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed, was a lie. The creatures were not the product of his ancestors' mistakes. They were the result of something far older, far darker, and no matter what he did, they would never stop hunting. As the creatures closed in, their growls filling the air, Garrick realized the truth. There was no escape. There was no hope. The curse would claim him, and it would claim everyone he loved. The only thing left was to face the inevitable. And then, just as the creatures reached the factory doors, Garrick made his choice. But it was already too late. The Silent One had already won. Garrick stood at the edge of the town, his heart pounding in his chest. The creatures were closing in, their glowing eyes lighting up the dark night. The air was thick with tension, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble as if the land itself was alive. He had no choice. The curse had already claimed too much, and he couldn't let it destroy everything. He had to fight back. With trembling hands, he gripped the old, rusted rifle that Isolde and the warden had given him. It felt like a feeble weapon against the horrors he was about to face. But it was all he had. He had learned everything he could about the curse, about the creatures, and about the land that bound them. But nothing could have prepared him for the terror that awaited. The town, once peaceful and quiet, was now a battleground. People were running, screaming, trying to escape, but there was nowhere to hide. The creatures were everywhere, shifting in and out of the shadows, their long limbs stretching and twisting in unnatural ways. Their growls echoed through the night, a constant reminder that they were closing in on everyone. Garrick's breath came in ragged gasps as he moved through the town, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for any sign of the creatures. He had no plan, no strategy, just the desperate hope that somehow, someway, he could stop them. But deep down, he knew it was hopeless. The curse was too powerful, too ancient. And the creatures, they were part of it. They were part of the land, and nothing would ever change that. As he reached the center of the town, he saw them, more of the creatures, their glowing eyes fixed on him, their twisted forms moving toward him with eerie precision. He raised the rifle, his hands shaking, and fired. The shot echoed through the air, but it had no effect. The creature it hit didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, its eyes locked on Garrick as if mocking him. He fired again and again, but it was the same result. The creatures didn't die. They didn't even slow down. They were unstoppable. Garrick stumbled back, his heart racing. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, suffocating him. There was no escape. The creatures were everywhere, and no matter how hard he fought, they kept coming. Their growls grew louder, their forms more grotesque as they closed in on him. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the Silent One appeared. He stepped out of the shadows, his face unreadable, his eyes cold and empty. Garrick's blood ran cold. The Silent One had been watching him, waiting for this moment. "You can't win, Garrick." The Silent One's voice was like ice, cutting through the chaos around them. "You were never meant to. The creatures are not meant to be destroyed. They are part of the land, they are bound to it, and the land will never let them go." Garrick's heart sank. "What are you saying? I've been fighting for nothing." The Silent One's expression didn't change. The creatures were never meant to be defeated. They are the land's protectors, bound by the curse. They are not just beasts, they are the spirits of those who were sacrificed long ago, and they will never leave. No matter how many times you try to fight them, they will always return. Garrick's mind reeled. But the sacrifice, the curse, it's all for nothing? The Silent One nodded. The land is eternal, the curse is eternal, and so are the creatures. They will never stop hunting. They will never stop claiming new victims. Your bloodline, your sacrifice, it means nothing in the end. The creatures are part of the land. They are the land. Garrick's legs buckled beneath him. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he realized the horrifying truth. There was no end to the curse, no escape. The creatures would never stop. They were bound to the land, and the land would always claim new victims. He had been fighting for nothing. The creatures were closing in now, their growls deafening, their eyes glowing with hunger. Garrick could feel the weight of the curse crushing him, the land pulling him in, suffocating him. He had failed. There was no hope, no chance of survival. And then, just as the creatures reached him, Garrick made his final choice. But it was already too late. The Silent One had already won. Garrick's body lay motionless on the cold ground, his chest no longer rising and falling with the beat of life. The creatures, their glowing eyes now dim, slowly melted back into the darkness, vanishing as if they had never been there. The town, once full of life and hope, was now a ghostly shell of its former self. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned, and the air hung heavy with the stench of decay. But even in this silence, there was an unsettling presence, an ominous weight that pressed down on everything. The Silent One stood over Garrick's body, his expression unreadable. He bent down, his cold, lifeless eyes never leaving Garrick's face. A whisper escaped his lips, so soft that it seemed to carry with the wind. "The curse is not over. It's only just begun." As those words echoed through the empty streets, the creatures reappeared. They materialized from the shadows, their dark forms emerging as if they had never left. Their glowing eyes once again pierced the night, their twisted bodies shifting and contorting as they moved in unison. The creatures were back, and they were hungrier than ever. The town, now reduced to rubble, seemed to hold its breath. The curse had not been broken. It was still alive, still breathing, still feeding on the land. And as the creatures began to move once more, there was no sign of an end. The cycle would continue. The land would continue to claim new victims, one after another, and there would be no escape. The Silent One stood in the shadows, watching as the creatures moved through the ruins of the town. He knew the truth. The curse was eternal. It had always been, and it would always be. No matter how many times the cycle repeated, no matter how many sacrifices were made, the curse would never be broken. The creatures were bound to the land, and the land would never let them go. And as the creatures closed in on the few remaining souls in the town, there was no hope left. The terror that had plagued Eldridge Falls would never end. The cycle would repeat itself again and again until the land had claimed all who dared to live on it. The curse would continue forever. The horror, it seemed, was never truly over. It had only just begun.